Lucas, my name is Lucas Haag, extension agronomist with K-State. So I cover 29 counties in northwest, northwest, north central. So actually Ellsworth is my southeast corner up to the Nebraska line and west to the Colorado line. So I work out of Colby and Tribune. And so we got some slides here. I'm going to talk more on the nitrogen side. Then Dorvar's going to come back on phos and some of the other nutrients. And Dorvar's bailed me out. Most of these are his slides. If you might have heard a little blip on the news about K-State got attacked in a cyber hacking thing. Yeah, it's not good. So I didn't have access to anything of mine this morning, and anyways, still working on that. So it's not a good situation. So make sure you have backups and lots of them, and some of them off site, and all the things that we know are supposed to do. So anyway, so gonna go through just to hit a few high points on nitrogen, and then I'm gonna finish up by kind of pointing out what some of the major changes are in our recommendations. And you guys have been with me before, know I'd like to keep it pretty informal. If you've got questions, comments, or whatever, it's always easier to handle it while we're at that point than to try and remember the question and come back to it. So I'm going to start off a little bit with just and maybe it's a little bit from a trivia standpoint, but I feel like I wanted to oh no, I guess those slides have been. Is this working now? Okay. Yeah. All right. So I guess we've already done the overview a little bit, but really, and a lot of our research effort right now across the state is focused on increasing nitrogen use efficiency, and there's different ways of looking at that. But what we're really focused on is a lot of that has to do with really what we're talking about is fertilizer recovery efficiency, fertilizer use efficiency of that fertilizer, that nitrogen we're putting out. How much of that are we actually turning into marketable yield? So what are the management some things we can do to improve that? We'll talk a little bit about additives and how that plays a role in some of our different loss mechanisms. And when to use those wisely when they have the greatest chance of ROI. The last couple of years, we've talked a lot about the economics of fertility management, and so it's just always good. This is a real basic example, but if we average, this would be 118 trials across Kansas, and so this is part of a statewide project we have. So we've got stuff clear over at Ottawa and Topeka, Rossville, and we've got stuff clear out at Tribune and scattered in between. But just kind of this, thinking about this generalized response to nitrogen across these 118 trials, if we think about, it's just always good to keep in mind that the agronomic optimum and the economic optimum aren't necessarily the same thing, right? Okay, it is if you assume that nitrogen's free and application's free, but I don't think any of us have rolled into that good of a deal yet. So anyways, we, again, across all these sites, the agronomic optimum in rate is coming in here somewhere around the 220 mark. But, if we think about that economic optimum, typically, and we've talked about this before, because it's concerning to me here in the last couple of years, well, especially, we had nitrogen over $1 a pound, and I'd have guys call and say, well, thinking about cutting back on our nitrogen rates. It's like, well, what are you actually thinking about? Well, we're gonna cut everything 40-50%. It's like, well, that sounds a little steep. Let's slow down and think about this for a minute. But in general, even in that extreme scenario, where he's at nitrogen $1 a pound, basically what we were generally talking about is is really still only about a 10 to 15% reduction is where we wanted to be to hit that economic optimum. And because, at the end of the day, there's still no other crop input that has the return on investment that nitrogen does, even at $1 a pound. And the economic cost of being short, is not a place we want to operate most of the time. And so we think about, and what we're really sensitive to is that price ratio between what's the value of corn, what's it costing me for N? Okay. And so if you think about a corn to N price ratio, oftentimes our long-term average, maybe we're down here in this, 6 to 8 type range. But if we're talking about corn being, really high value, and if we had cheap N, that's going to push us further out. Maybe this, price ratio of 12. we get in a scenario, if we're down around $4 corn and high priced in, that backs us down a little bit further. But again, if you look at that entire range there, even from the clear bottom to top end of that, we're talking a swing of, maybe 15-20%, across a really wide range there in terms of how much that would adjust that. So again, I think, fortunately, fertilizer prices have moderated some compared to where we were. Of course, we've also given a lot up in the grains also, but I think the take home message is we want to be sensitive to what that price ratio is, but we can get a little too carried away too. We don't want to make huge swings. Again, that's kind of, that 10% example in terms of change. Okay, so if we think about what are the drivers that can affect nitrogen use efficiency, we think about what are our loss mechanisms. So that's really what these first three things are here, and I know you guys are familiar with that. But, volatilization, I would argue is probably one of our greater challenges. Certainly as we move here west, volatilization is our greatest loss pathway. Denitrification is something that we can have challenges with in this part of the world. Leaching as well, especially if we get on some sandier soils, river bottom type scenarios. But then this fourth one, immobilization, and I'd argue this really isn't a loss. We're not necessarily losing that nitrogen, but certainly as we think about no-till, reduced till systems, how much of that nitrogen are we getting tied up in the residue? Okay, and if it's tied up in the residue, it does make it. If it's not in the soil or not tied up in a growing plant, it does become a little more suspect to loss. So again, just a little bit of a review here in terms of what drives these processes. The key thing to keep in mind is that many of these are microbially driven. So what are the things that drive microbial activity? Heat, moisture, or things that can really fuel that along. So, if we kind of work our way through the crop year, and if we think about, for example, fall applied anhydrous, okay, and we have that recommendation of we really don't want to be putting on fall anhydrous until we get soil temps below 50 degrees. Because again, that comes back to this is a microbially driven thing. We put anhydrous in the ground, it's stable, it's not water soluble, it's not going to leach, okay, it's not going to volatilize, it's not going to get converted to nitrous oxide. That's a pretty stable form in the soil. But this process of nitrification, we convert that from ammonia to nitrate. Okay, that's a microbially driven process. We're above 50 degrees, we're going to have that go on, and so we start converting that ammonia into nitrate, which is leachable, which is exposed to our various loss pathways. And so that's why that recommendation comes back in. We'll talk here in a minute. I got some data from Dorvar talking about InServe and the nitrification inhibitors and what type of protection they bias in that scenario. Of course, so then the next phase of that, denitrification, is where we go from nitrate to basically gassing that off. And again, it's a process. The thing that's different here is it requires, we either got to have higher temperatures, 75 degrees or higher, or, and I think this is probably the bigger issue, and I think a lot about, South Central Kansas in this scenario, those areas out there that've got fairly low infiltration rates on some of them soils, a little more clay, really flat fields, not a lot of natural drainage. We can have water standing in fields for quite some time. And that's really what can drive this denitrification deal. If we're in waterlogged conditions, anaerobic conditions, that's what really can drive this denitrification process and the losses there. And so here's kind of looking at what's that combination of either temperature or length of saturation and what type of losses we might see. So you can see here, both the time component, if we're in these really warm temperatures, it only takes about 3 days of saturation. We're talking about, up to 60% loss of the nitrate in the soil. Now that's a pretty extreme example, but even in some of these more moderate type scenarios, 10 to 25%, that's not an insignificant number either, in terms of potential loss on the denitrification side. So we're kind of on this topic then of ammonia of anhydrous ammonia and that conversion from ammonia into nitrate. I think this is also kind of interesting to think about is how fast can that occur? Even within the growing season. So this is spring applied, 150 pounds of anhydrous. And then basically sample this, the average of 4 locations across 2 years. So we got 8 site years of data in here. So 150 pounds applied pre-plant spring ammonia, and then sampling that through the growth stages through the year and seeing, okay, how fast does that conversion take place? And really the take home message here is if you look at, what's really happening between V2 and V4 here. Okay, our N present in the form of ammonia is going down, but at the same time we got nitrate coming up, right? That conversion is taking place from the ammonia form to the nitrate form. And so basically, it's the vast majority of that conversion in the growing season as those soils warm up is happening pretty quickly. And so, when we put things out in the ammonia form, even in a spring application, it's not really a delayed availability. It's not really like a slow release nitrogen. Okay, once we hit that soil temperature that drives that conversion process, it happens fairly rapidly. Okay, you see the nitrate come up. Now then you'll notice here from V8 forward, the nitrate nitrogen really starts dropping off. But what's going on here? What starts to happen at V8? What's speeding up? It's in the plant, right? That's when our very rapid uptake starts. V8, V10, that's when we're really pulling hard on what we have in the soil. And so that's what you can see here, V8 to V12, basically 100 pounds in the nitrate form has went somewhere. And I'll point out that this is only in the top 12 inches. This isn't taking into account what's happening underneath that. And so certainly by the time we're in V8 to V12, we're pulling from much deeper depths than just the top foot. But anyways, I think it's interesting to think about how fast that conversion can occur once the soil warms up. And then, of course, just kind of reinforces what we know about that rapid uptake of in season. Okay, so back to the use of a nitrification inhibitor, things like N-Serve. Here's a variety of site years here. So again, either Ashland or Manhattan, or sometime we got also in the last 2 years, we got Rossville, which is over by Topeka. So Ashland Bottoms, that's the research farm south of Manhattan. And then, like I said, Rossville's over by Topeka. But, for a number of these years, again, if conditions are right, we're well timed when we're putting that high out, we're not necessarily always going to see a response from using a product like N-Serve, okay? But in the years that we do see that difference, that certainly covers the cost of the product in many years. N-Serve's gotten to be a pretty cost-effective thing to put on. How many guys in here are using hydrous? Nobody in here uses anhydrous. I'm wasting my time talking about this, ain't I? That just occurred to me. I won't spend much more. We've already spent too much time on this. But anyways, if you were in a situation, N-Serve can be a valuable product. Yes, sir.
What are your soil types Ashland and Rossville?
So Rossville's going to be depends where he's. Door of ours on here. Depends where you're at. That's the problem on some of these. Rossville can. I'm guessing they're going to be on a little more of a sandier type. That is river bottom ground, so it's kind of a silt loam mixed with some sand. At Ashland, that's also going to be river bottom ground, but more kind of a silt. There's a little more clay in some of that. Wouldn't be, yeah, gonna be nothing here is really true, like blow sand per se. They're all going to have at least some healthy amount of silt mixed in, but some of, yeah, Rossville is going to have some sand in it as well.
On the more clay soil, you probably see the benefit of that, don't you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's possible. Well, actually, on the more sand, the more likely you'd have, because really it's, because if you think about what that N-Serve is doing, it's preventing that conversion to nitrate, right? So the sandier soil we're in, the higher risk we have of leaching. And so, our greatest responses are going to come from a sandier type soil. Because even like if we're in a heavy silt loam, or if we got something with a little more clay that water's not moving as fast through. Even if it goes ahead and converts to nitrate, we're at a lot less risk for leaching. Just because of how much slower we're moving the water through. So, yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, it's going to be on the sand. The more sand, the more likely we're going to see a response to the insert. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on this. It means we don't have a lot of use of ammonia in here. In general, over the years, though, even at long-term average prices, it tends to pay. Okay, this gets into something maybe a little more useful is thinking about all the places that we can use dry urea in a cropping system. So this is looking at side dress scenario. And if you think about this, here we are, a June, application of urea. That's really kind of a worst case scenario from a volatilization loss standpoint. Higher temperatures, maybe we catch some humid days or some moisture to drive that process. Here's 2 years of data, again, looking at just corn grain yields versus N rate. And the thing I want to point out is if you look at the straight urea and these response curves, basically we were peaking out about 190 bushel yield. And it's taken us about 215, 220 pounds of N to get there. Okay. If we go with a urea and anvil, so we got anvil and agritane are the two inhibitors, two of many of the inhibitors on the market, but the two we got in the trial here. Add in the anvil, not only is our maximum yield increase, we're now pushing about 200 bushel corn, but the peak of that in terms of how much N it took to get there, we've backed that off some, maybe closer to about that 200 pound mark. And then if we look at the urea agritane, now we're talking about 205 bushel corn, and we backed off a little bit further, maybe around that 185, 190 mark. And so again, not only are we getting a little more yield out of that when we're able to reduce that volatilization, it's giving us more grain yield, but also a lower optimum N rate because we're simply losing less N out of the system. And so there's more of it available there for the crop to take advantage of. So that's going to be a reoccurring theme, and that's a big part of what we're doing in these statewide NUE nitrogen use efficiency trials. Is we're looking at a variety of both source and placement and products like the inhibitors to get a real handle on what are the trade-offs here. And so here's some examples we've seen, and these are fairly typical of what we're seeing at a number of sites. This just happens to be irrigated corn at Rossville in 21. So the plotted line here represents the use of urea broadcast at planting time. Okay. And so, but then what we can go in and say, okay, how does that compare to UAN coulter injected at planting? Okay. And we can look at the differences there. Oops. And so basically, the urea broadcast at planting, in order to get to our maximum economic yield there, is taking us just shy of 150 pounds of N when we were using dry spread urea on the surface. Okay. In order to get at that same equivalent yield, it was only taking us 120 pounds when we were coultering on UAN. Because again, it goes back to, simply, basically what we're looking at here is, what I'm guessing is we had essentially 30 pounds per acre loss through volatilization. Essentially what we're seeing in this scenario. But before I was in agronomy, my undergrad was actually over in the ag engineering side, and so I like steel, and what farmer doesn't like to buy new equipment, right? And so, but what's interesting, and we've talked about this some before, is by actually having some of these side by side comparisons, we can start looking at the economics of think about when nitrogen was $1 a pound, and we can cut back, essentially save $30 an acre on N and raise the same yield. But then that begs the question of, okay, maybe I don't have an applicator to do that. Well, then that gets into more of a machinery and an economics deal. Is okay, what type of investment, if this is consistent over time, what type of an investment can I justify to be coultering on UAN versus dry spread urea? And start to look at some of those questions. In general, so this is the average of four sites from last year. And this is kind of the trend that I think you would tend to expect to see, but was certainly showing up in the data. thinking about in terms of agronomic efficiency, in terms of, again, that fertilizer recovery, how much, for every pound of fertilizer we're getting out there, how good of a job are we doing converting that into grain? UAN coulter on top, followed by urea with an inhibitor treatment on it. Super U is a product that I don't think we're probably quite as familiar with, but it's actually has the inhibitor actually part of the manufacturing process of the prill, and so has some unique properties that way. Versus UAN stream, what about a stream in season? ESN, the slow release polymer coated urea hasn't gotten a lot of traction simply because the cost of it per pound of N basis, I think, kind of takes it out of the picture for most people, unless they're maybe looking at it just for like a side dress application later on. And then UAN dribbled on the surface. So you can kind of see that relative ranking there in terms of what we've seen in some of the data. Here's some dryland work out of Hayes. So again, the line is urea broadcast on the surface of planting. At Hayes, Augustine actually has the ability to he's still using urea, but he's putting it below the soil surface. Okay. And so again, it's back to, it's not so, we think about that volatilization piece, part of its source, but the big driver there is getting it in the ground. Okay. So anyways, if we look at kind of that overall response there, again, we're looking at this differential between urea broadcast at planting versus subsurface urea before planting. Again, about a 25-pound differential in terms of what's required to get at the same yield, which, in a dryland scenario, this is essentially our water limited yield. But how much in did it take to get us there? And so a pretty consistent deal. Same thing at sorghum and at Ashland Bottom, South Manhattan, 100 bushel type sorghum. Again, 28-pound difference between urea, surface spread urea versus, now in this case, it's actually compared to streamed UAN, but with the inhibitor on. Okay. And the thing about the inhibitors, be it, so NBPT or Agritane, there's a lot of generics on the market now. Basically what those bias is essentially 2 weeks. And the hope is you're going to get some precip or something in that 2 weeks to then get that moved into the soil. But that's essentially the time. 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks is essentially what those products are buying. And you got to view it a little bit like an insurance policy, because it's all about, so this last year at Tribune, we had some trials set up and we was doing all sorts of how we was placing it, surface versus placed and everything. Spent all day putting these trials out, and it rained an inch that night. That's pretty much a wasted effort at that point, because they're all pretty equivalent when it rain, when it comes in and rains an inch and moves them all into the soil. So essentially, you're kind of buying some insurance is what you're doing. And if it comes in and rains, yeah, maybe you didn't get your dollar's worth out of the Agritane, but hey, your yield potential is higher now, so you should be smiling about that. So, but in general, if we think about things that are doing better or better than the other treatments, broadcast super U, coultered on UAN, streamed UAN, all tends to be about equal. Or had these on these different slides here for the sites that he'd ran this on. But again, it's kind of that same relative ranking that we'd looked at earlier in terms of what you'd expect among these different methods. So again, if we think about our loss mechanism and what can we do from a management standpoint, so volatilization, it really affects urea and nitrate. What can we do? We can use an inhibitor. We can choose a different end source. Again, remember, what's UAN stand for? Urea ammonium nitrate. How many of you guys remember being able to use straight ammonium nitrate? What was the real benefit of that? Won't volatilize, right? And so that's, the thing about UAN, you've already got some protection on, roughly half of the nitrogen that's in solution. And so that goes back to having some flexibility, being able to switch between dry and liquid. I don't know particular of your guys' markets down here, but at least at Colby, we've got years where UAN's cheaper than urea and vice versa. You just never know how that's going to flip out. But if I can buy UAN for the same money as urea, I'm buying UAN because I've already got, especially if I'm surface applying, I've already got some protection on some of those pounds of N out there just by the nature of the formulation. So, okay, denitrification, the use of the nitrification inhibitors, choosing a marine source, slow release urea in. If you've got a field that is prone to waterlogging and anaerobic conditions, maybe that's a better candidate for application closer to planting time, getting out of that part of the year where that can be an issue. Leaching, again, nitrification inhibitors, we're putting on anhydrous, slow down the conversion of the anhydrous to nitrate. Another place for slow release urea in can make a role. But again, I think this volatilization deal, I think, is really probably one of our biggest challenges, at least in the western half of the state. And I think taking a closer look at placement is going to be one of the ways we get at that, or through the use of the inhibitor type products. Immobilization, again, back to the, residue and tie up there, really that's a placement thing. What can we do to get that below the surface? The one other thing I'd bring up there is I think there's some trade-offs. If I think about if I've got really good wheat stubble, I've got, 70, 80 bushel wheat stubble out there. There is something to be said for dry spread urea, because those prills, have the ability to kind of plinko their way down through the residue and actually make it to the soil surface. Whereas if we go out there with UAN, even streamed, or, we know that most of that's going to land on residue. And what's the potential for tie up there? And so, I think there's potentially some trade-offs there. Okay, questions on comments so far? All right, we'll get into everyone's favorite topic, Pivot Bio. How many of you have not heard of Pivot Bio yet? That'd be almost impossible for the amount of discussion and marketing it's had. Okay, so we have had some Pivot Bio work going on at K-State, both in corn and sorghum, maybe not as extensive as we would like to have, but and I guess the thing that's been interesting, or maybe I'll give you the punchline up front. We do see there is something going on there. We can see it in a lot of our sampling through the year. Let me back up a bit and talk about how we set these trials up. So when we are doing these trials, we're doing a full set of nitrogen rates, and then with and without the Pivot Bio product. Okay. And that way we can see if there's a differential, where's it showing up, across the whole range. I would say, I think one of the, as this product's been rolled out on the market, producers have been really encouraged to do on-farm trials, and I think that's a good thing. But I think what it has shown is you got to be careful about what those treatments should look like, okay? Because here's been a real common setup is, they'll say, okay, do your farmer practice, and then do your farmer practice minus 40 pounds, but with Pivot Bio. What's missing from the picture here? Okay, so if you go out and you do your farmer practice minus 40 pounds with Pivot Bio, and it makes the same as your farmer practice, do you know that you got something out of the Pivot Bio? Maybe if you would have just done less 40 pounds, you would have got the same yield. Without that treatment in there, you don't know whether the Pivot Bio actually contributed anything, or whether the answer was you could just cut 40 pounds. And I say Pivot Bio, and I don't mean to pick on them. This goes for any of these products that are out there on the market. That we think through what's the right way to evaluate these, because it is not hard to find. And I'd actually suggest in a vast number of instances, people can cut 40 pounds and not see any difference. Especially if you hit a good year and we've got lots of mineralization going on, there's easily plus or minus 40 pounds of slop out there just in what's happening, what could come from mineralization. And so if you don't have that, if you're going to do, cut the rate, I think that's good, but you got to have the cut rate with the product and the cut rate without the product. Otherwise, you don't know if the answer was, well, I could have just cut the rate and got the same answer. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So I think, the on-farm trialing is good. We just got to be smart about how we set these things up so that we're actually answering the question we think we are. Because without that, you really don't know whether the product made a difference or not. And I've seen I've worked with a lot of guys on their own farm trials, and they brought data into me and we've gone through it, and that's, like I say, there's a lot of places out there we can just cut 40 pounds and probably not notice a difference in a lot of years. And so.
It also goes back to knowing how much nitrogen is in your profile, like 0 to 24.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Craig. That's the other thing is ask, some of these guys we worked with said, okay, well, do you have a profile nitrate sample, from before planting, before application? We don't. And so it's like, well, it's not uncommon to see, especially depending upon what the year before was, it's not uncommon to have 100 pounds of residual, floating out there. And so even, when we're trying, actually, I'm gonna send Craig an email. We're looking for a site somewhere in this area, but it's hard to find sites on farmer fields that don't have a lot of residual nitrate. If we're trying to find a site low in nitrogen to do some trials, those are actually harder to find than you would think. Even on our research stations, to ensure that I have somewhere to do this type of trial work, I set aside a chunk of wheat that we purposely, all of our row crop gets planted into wheat stubble. I set aside some wheat that we purposely don't top dress with the idea we're trying to mine out any residual nitrate so that we got somewhere we can do nitrogen trials. When you're looking for a low nitrogen spot, they're harder to find than you might think. So yeah, that's a good point, Craig. So okay, so here's some corn data. This is at Manhattan. This might not be showing up the best in the back there. So the top line, the green line is with the proven product. The red line is without. This is plant nitrogen, plant uptake. Okay. And so, the error bars aren't quite separating, but numerically we are seeing we are seeing higher plant uptake with the proven product. But when we look at the grain yield, statistically at the 0, 50, and 100 pound end rates, no difference. And actually at the 150 pound end rate, I can't quite explain this, but we're actually seeing slightly lower yields. I'm sorry, we are seeing slower yields at the 150 pound rate with the proven, higher yields with the proven than with that at the 150 rate. So that's 1 year of corn data. We did see that pan out. We've also been doing work in sorghum. So this is 3 years of data. Kind of again at that 140 bushel type sorghum yields, 140, 120. And in these 3 scenarios, we're not seeing any response in yields across there. What I will say is in some of our early season stuff, we're running green seeker, handheld green seeker across this, measuring NDVI. We're doing some whole plant sampling and looking at total N uptake. And what I would tell you is, there's something going on. We see things happening in season. We're just not necessarily always seeing it translate out in yield or as a direct replacement for X pounds of nitrogen. So I think, and I won't put words in Dorvar's mouth, but we've hashed this over a lot. And I think our general consensus is there are things going on with these products. There's gazillions, not gazillions, but there's a boatload of money being dumped into the development of these things. Something is going to emerge. Some days something is going to emerge as a very solid product out of this type of stuff likely. So I think it's, it warrants further testing. It warrants good on-farm trials because, I think there is promise out there. Thought we had okay, yeah, I guess it is on here. Kind of a summary slide, but again, combination source placement time, use of inhibitors important. On this biological saying, consistently inconsistent is kind of what our data shows so far. Certainly not giving up on it, and it's certainly not, it's not, there's something going on here. It's not completely, pixie dust or something. There is something happening. So our research so far shows potential. There's ongoing developments. Again, I think it's a good place for on-farm trials. We struggle with it at the university because there is just so many things out on the market, and to do these trials right takes a lot of resources. And so the work that's been done, Pivot Bio was funding some of it. The sorghum work, Pivot Bio put some money in, and then your sorghum commission matched those dollars that let us basically, Pivot Bio was paying for the trials in Manhattan, sorghum commission matched their money, and that let us put some trials out west at Tribune. But these things are, pretty intensive deals, because to do it right, you really need the full range of nitrogen rates with and without the product. And that's, it eats up a lot of plots to do that. Questions, comments? Anyone in here? I know we had good conversation up at Smith Center. We had some guys in the room that had done some on-farm trials with Pivot Bio. I guess curious what you guys, anyone in here have any experience or thoughts on that? I don't know. It's interesting. There's, like I say, a lot of work, a lot of money being done in that area. So we're gonna skip the manure stuff. Dorvar had this one slide thrown in here, and this goes back to the point Craig made about soil sampling. There is tremendous value in knowing what's out there. Basically the ability to raise a wheat crop on residual N if you know it's out there. And so we can make that adjustment in the recommendations, as long as we get the sample. And I realize 24-inch can often be challenging depending upon situations, but get as much as you can and make sure you note that on the sheet in terms of what depth it did actually come from. Because in order, when we measure nitrate in the lab, the number that comes out of the instrument is parts per million. In order to get that into a quantity, into pounds per acre, we multiply, the depth is involved in that conversion. And so if he's only able to get a 14-inch sample, we need to know that, so that we're doing the math right to actually calculate what's out there. So. Okay, a little bit on soil sample handling to follow up what Craig had visited about. Oops. Oh, no, that comes later. One comment about volatilization. Top dress on wheat. This is from a multi-year study that Dorvar and Romulo and I forget who else was involved with, just finished up. Eduardo Santos in our department. This up in Saline County, looking at top dress of urea on wheat at green up or prior to green up, actually. And we've generally considered that as being a fairly safe time in terms of minimizing volatilization losses. At the same time, though, there's been a lot of work done in Montana over the past 10 years or so, looking at top dressing with urea, and they were showing what were actually some very concerning levels of loss from that type of application. So they set out to take a look at this. So we got two different scenarios here. So this is kind of a best case scenario and a worst case scenario out of all the site years that were evaluated. So this happened to be in a conventional tillage field. So we got straight urea and then urea plus an NBPT type product. So Agritane or one of the generics. Days after fertilization, again, basically, that inhibitor knocks that down, basically keeps it at 0. But even without the inhibitor, out there at about day 30, we're talking about a 2 to 3% type loss. The flip side of that over here is kind of this worst case scenario, where you can see the inhibitor again kind of kept it down to about that 3% mark, but the straight urea losses kind of in that low 20, 23, 22% type range. But again, it's all environmental. What type of conditions do we have? Do we have a period of time where we warm up a little bit? Days like today where we've got fog or a lot of humidity in the atmosphere, that's enough to start eating away on the outside edges of that prill and allow that volatilization process to continue. Yes, sir.
pH loss.
Yes, that's an excellent point. So pH can really drive that as well. Can be a real factor in there also. Yeah, which is certainly a concern as we move west. Higher pHs we know can affect that process. Yeah, that's a good point. So again, just again, any of the inhibitors, it's kind of tough because it's a probabilities game. How often do I think I'm going to have this type of loss? Obviously you can buy a lot of Agritane for that, for that type of loss there. So just being aware of the conditions, using a little bit of a, the long term, the 2-week outlooks aren't great, but it's probably better than nothing in terms of, what's my risk over the next 2 weeks? What's the likelihood of getting some precip? What's the likelihood of needing that product paying for me? Okay, soil sample handling, to follow up on some of the stuff Craig mentioned, this is some work, a graduate student of Dorovar's done. You know, obviously we want to get the samples to the lab as soon as possible, but you know, Murphy's Law sometimes happens. What happens if it takes a while? So I think this is a really interesting project he did. So he went up to the North Farm there in Manhattan, took 100 pounds of soil, thoroughly mixed it, sieved it, got it uniform, and then bagged, just like Craig was showing the sample bags there, bagged subsample bags. Okay, had 3 replications of this. Had 1 samples that went straight to the lab. And then we had this group of samples that then went into a deep freeze. And then this group of samples got thrown in the back of a toolbox and a picket. Okay. And just to track what would happen. Now I'll give you the details here in a minute, but again, we're kind of setting up a worst case scenario here, but again, wanted to see what could happen. He then went and pulled out 3 bags each on days 2, 4, 6, on out through 14, either pulled them out of the deep freeze or pulled them out of the toolbox. Okay, and then ran them through the lab to see what would be different. These are just the basics: 7.6 pH, 2.7 organic matter, dry land, strip till, silt loam soil, 19% water content, so not sopping wet, but there was some moisture in the sample, and that plays a role when we see what happened here on the storage of them. Okay, this was done in June. This is June 9th. Here is June 23rd, 24th. Okay. This is, the red line is air temperature inside the toolbox. The black line is outside air temperature measured on the weather station. So our outdoor temperatures, we were in the high 90s, hit 100 on a day there. Temperature inside the toolbox, had a couple days there exceeded 125, but you know, basically all those days we were over 100 inside the toolbox. If you think about a moist soil sample and you put it in that type of heat, you guys, some of you are nodding already. You can see where this is going on what that's going to do to some of these lab results. Okay, these are all the everything that was ran in the lab. And so basically, I was looking at what's the effect of storage environment, what's the effect of time, and then is there an interaction between the two? There was no changes observed in pH, buffer pH, organic matter, phos, potassium, or ammonia in. Over time, this was interesting. Over time, did see a change in the micros. Did not matter if they were in the deep freeze or the truck bed, just time affected those. We'll revisit that here in a minute. And then, as some of you would expect, the biggest issue here was in the nitrate and in sulfur. And there we saw big differences in both time and how they were stored. Here's the micros. So this is an interesting deal. Statistically, these did trend downward. The concentrations did trend downward over time. Didn't matter if it was in the deep freeze or the truck bed or in the toolbox. Statistically, these were valid, but from a practical standpoint, from an agronomic recommendation standpoint, it really wouldn't have changed, you know, what the answer was. Okay. Here's the bigger deal, and that's on the nitrogen side, as you'd expect. Ammonia did not change. Okay, not surprisingly, no difference there whether it was in the toolbox or the freezer. But what's happening here on the ammonia? What process are we driving? We got a moist soil sample, and we put heat in it. What microbial practice is that going to drive? Mineralization, right? That process of mineralizing in out of the organic matter into the nitrate form. That's really what we're driving here. So if you see on day 0, so the sample that came straight out of the field would have came back the equivalent of about 30 pounds per acre. Okay. The samples that were in the deep freeze never really varied from that. Days 2 on out through 14, 30 pounds per acre. When they were left in the toolbox, you put some heat, you got some moisture, we start mineralizing in. Samples we pull out here on day 12 and day 14, we're coming back with 100 pounds of N is what it would have came back as with the lab result from that time of basically incubating in that toolbox. So, you know, think about that. That's 70 pounds difference. You know, 70 pounds that appeared through poor handling of those soil samples. So again, kind of, if you've got moisture in and you can't get them to the lab right away, you know, those bags kind of have a wax-like liner in them. open them up, at least let them breathe, let them air dry until, if you don't got deep freeze room, at least open them up. Let them air dry to get a little bit of that moisture off the top side. Don't stick them next to, don't go take them into the shop and set them next to your oil fired heater right there. Try and get them to a more stable temp, let them breathe if you don't have time to get them there right away. Okay, so sample handling does affect soil test, warm storage temps. Like I say, again, it's no different when we talk about that whole mineralization in the soil. We're just doing it in a bag. Yeah, we just talked about all this, so get them air dry if you can. Okay, and the one last thing I was gonna bring up, this is some data we've just been working on. Craig mentioned about soil cores, and oftentimes we're talking about the example we classically use is for phosphorus and the number of cores in the bag and what type of noise that number comes back from the lab around that. And again, what we're trying to overcome with that, and it doesn't matter if you're doing a composite sample for a quarter or whether you're pulling a sample for a 2-acre grid, the number of cores is still important because what we're trying to overcome is small scale variability. Did I band apply my FOSS last year? Did I run cows on these stocks? Think about all the different sources of small scale variability. And if you're out and you pull a 5-core sample, and one of those 5 cores hits an old FOSS band or hits where a cow stood 2 years ago, what's that do to your lab result as opposed to if it's only 1 out of 15 cores? Okay, so that's what we're trying to that's why the number of cores is really important. In the early days of grid sampling, there was guys that were promoting this idea of, well, you only need for grid sampling, you only need 4 cores because we're just pulling a lot more samples out there. Well, the problem with that is you paid a lot of money to get a lot of data that's of pretty low quality because all that data is coming back with a huge error bar around it. Even though, yeah, you got a lot of points out in the field, they're all plus or minus 8 parts per million. So what did you really learn? Is the challenge there. So number of cores. So this is some work we've been doing looking at profile nitrate. How many cores do I have to get a good handle on profile nitrate? And this is kind of scary because pulling 24-inch samples by hand is not real exciting, right? And so that's, if you're doing any volume of this, you're moving to some type of hydraulic probe. This is from a site at Colby and a site at Perryton, Texas. This is dry land. But basically, we're coming up with roughly the same number in terms of, the number of cores to start flattening out this curve. So even if we're trying to get at a profile nitrate sample, it's taking us a fair number of cores to reduce the amount of air in that sample. And this, to be honest, surprised me. My hope was, okay, nitrate is fairly mobile in the soil. Now, granted, this after 2 dry years. My hope was that by the time we went through some time and soil water had redistributed in the soil, it would even out nitrate enough to where we could get by on fewer cores. But we're actually coming back with a surprisingly similar number than what we've talked about over the years for FOSS and some of our other things. So I don't know. We've got more data. This is very preliminary. We've got more site years we're going to dig through on this, but this is kind of our preliminary look. So. Okay, a few, these are kind of trivia things I just want to share. Being I manage the Tribune site, not necessarily directly applicable to what you guys are doing in here, but a really unique thing and some maybe some things to think about. We've got a really neat deal. This isn't the main station. This is the irrigation field we have at Tribune. It's about 6 miles away from our main station. K-State took over this ground in 1960. Prior to 60, this had been dry land wheat fallow. We think it was broken out probably sometime in the early 20s and then was just a dry land wheat fallow deal. The well was drilled in 60 and it's been irrigated ever since. What we have at Tribune, and you kind of see a bit of the checkerboarding pattern over here. This is the longest running irrigated sorghum fertility study in the world and the second longest running irrigated corn fertility study in the world. Both started in 1960. The only older irrigated corn one, University of Nebraska has up at Scotts Bluff. It started in 1912 when they first got ditch water up there. Ours is the oldest replicated one, though. That's so old. It's before we did replication in science, and so. But anyways, there's this area. This is the only area that we still do conventional tillage on. Everything else here is no till. We got a little bit of strip till. but we still do conventional till on this long-term study. So in both the corn and the sorghum, we've got multiple levels of P, multiple levels of N, and all combinations. On the corn, we also had a potassium treatment for the first 30 years. And in the first 30 years, we never saw a response to potassium. In 1991, 92, it was obvious though that at that time, our highest phos rate was 40 pounds. And back to what you were showing of Barney's data, in the mid 80s, we had started to see soil test P levels start to drop. Our corn yields had gotten good enough that 40 pounds of phos was not keeping up. So in 92, after 30 years of never seeing a potassium response, Alan decided to quit the potassium treatment and replace that with an 80-pound phos treatment. And so now on the sorghum side, we still have the potassium treatment in there, and over 62 years now, we have yet to really see a significant potassium response in that. Some of the other things that's interesting, so in the corn, again, we've talked about our long-term no-till nutrient stratification and lower pHs. Even with conventional till and a lot of mixing of the soil, we've still dropped pH by about a half a unit. Because again, any urea containing fertilizers, we go through that conversion process, it lowers pH a little bit. So you do that long enough, you drop pH. We've increased soil organic matter by about a third of a percent. And we were not maintaining soil test P with the 40 pounds of N. Here's soil pH. Again, it's really driven by nitrogen applied. Higher the N rate, the more we've dropped pH, which is not surprising. That's what we'd expect. And there's lots of theoretical stuff you can do on the back of the envelope, but this is what we've actually observed in terms of that drop over time, over 60 years. This is the one that gets a little more interesting. A couple of years ago, there was even an article written where the headline was, if you want to build soil organic matter, nitrogen might be your enemy. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And basically the argument was, if you have too much nitrogen in the system, you're burning up your organic matter, you're burning up your carbon. Our data at Tribune would certainly not support that. So we started in 1961, our initial soil organic matter was about 1.4%. Again, after decades of, tillage, wheat fallow. We're now up to about 2.1%, where we've got the higher rates of P and the highest rate of N. Okay, now this is with full-blown conventional tillage. We've still raised organic matter. But what are we doing? Well, we're basically trading Ogallala irrigation water for organic matter. I mean, because the fact that we're doing that, I mean, we're growing the take-home deal is you got to have the nitrogen and the phos to have the productivity. Because if you look here, look at the 40 pound, or excuse me, the 0P. The 0P, even at 200 pounds, we've not built as much organic matter there. Because it goes back to build organic matter, you have to start with a pile of stuff. You have to grow something. And the bigger the pile of stuff you grow, the more carbon you have available to convert into long-term stable organic matter. And so if you're starving the system of nitrogen, our long-term optimal N rate in the corn is somewhere around 165, 170 pounds. And so if you're nitrogen deficient and you're growing a smaller pile of stuff, you're not going to build organic matter as fast. And so again, it's surfaced a couple times, and it's not just our data. There's a number of long-term trials that point back to, no, you have to have adequate fertility out there. You got to grow the pile of stuff before you can worry about converting it into organic matter. And so it's not as sensationalistic as some of the headlines, but anyways, at least that's what our data show. Relative yield, I think this is interesting. Our zero plots have received no fertility since 1960. What type of yields do you think we raise in those? About 60, 70 bushel corn, year in, year out, where we've had no fertilizer since 1960. The thing about that I think is most interesting is we know there's a lot of unavailable mineral P in our soils. It gives us some insight. We're removing somewhere around 20 pounds of phos every year from those plots in the grain. Where's it coming from? And so it gives you some insight as to what's that slow rate of mineralization of the mineral P into plant available form. It's happening. There's at least enough of that happening that's letting us remove about 20 pounds every year in the grain. So I think that's to me is kind of one of the more interesting things to think about. These plots, the zeros, they still come in at a soil test level about 6 part per million. You'll never see a soil test level go to 0. You know, you basically kind of hit this basement number, 5, 6, 7 part per million. That's about as low as you'll see a soil test phos number go. And that's kind of, and basically within the first 10 years, we had mined it down to that. And then it's basically been a flat line ever since. What's interesting in the sorghum, we've actually seen pH go down more in the sorghum than the corn. I don't have a good explanation for that. We've increased organic matter more in the sorghum than the corn. I think there's some questions there about sorghum residue and its durability. Does it convert better to organic matter? Or do we got more root biomass under the sorghum than the corn? A lot of questions there, but we have built slightly more organic matter in the sorghum than we have on the corn side of things. Anyways, yeah, that's in the sorghum. We've dropped pH a little bit more. That's just soil test values. Okay, I'm already at my time limit, so yeah, so that's it on slides. I'm just going to very briefly point out the changes in here to be aware of. Probably on page number 2, that table there for phos and potassium removal, that table used to be at the very end of the document. This is probably, I think, one of the more used tables in here, so I just want to point out that it's moved. That's on so table 1 on page 2. So how much P, how much K are you removing per bushel of grain or per ton of silage? So that's pretty handy stuff to have. The real changes, the real big changes. So there's been some minor changes on page 3 in terms of the different credits, the different adjustments. Same thing on page 4. Most of that is largely unchanged. The biggest changes are on page 5. And we've been talking about these for a couple of years, so it shouldn't be completely new. But if you look there on the corn recommendations, we've now, for the first time, split out irrigated and dry land, because we know irrigated just has a higher internal use efficiency in terms of how many pounds of N it takes to raise a bushel of corn. So we've got that split out. So if you look, the equations up there above, so you got IE, FE, and SE. Those are the things you've got to pick for your particular situation and plug into there. So IE is just, are you irrigated or dry land? So we're saying it only takes 0.84 pounds of N per bushel on the irrigated, 0.88 on dry land. FE, fertilizer recovery efficiency. So this ties into everything we was talking about earlier. That's kind of the range there is from 0.55, 0.65. So 0.55 would be on the low end of efficiency. So that'd be like fall broadcast. Okay, well, really broadcast applied, broadcast urea with no inhibitor, or fall applied would be in that 0.55 efficiency. At the other end of that would be our real efficient. So if we're culturing on UAN, if we're doing some sort of split application, if we are doing fertigation, those would all be at that 0.65 in terms of efficiency. If you're doing something like streamed UAN or streamed UAN with an inhibitor, I'm going to put that somewhere in between, maybe around that 0.6 mark. Okay, that kind of gives you the range there of efficiency values that you can choose from to stick in for your particular scenario. The third piece of that, soil efficiency. So in other words, if you have a profile soil test, what % of that do you expect to recover? And so if we're on medium textured, if we're on silt loam soils, and if we're generally kind of in the western half of the state, we're going to use a soil efficiency of 1. If we're on something that's a little sandier, or if we're in a higher precip zone, if we're in the eastern part of the state, we're going to stick in a 0.7 in terms of how much of that profile in we expect to recover. Any questions on any of those 3 things? That's really the big change is you got to pick those, for your scenario. It's a little more work, it's a little more complicated, but I think these are, our goal is really to work towards having a recommendation system that gives you a rec that's more specific to your operation. instead of believing that we've got this one equation that we can cover the whole state with, you know. This is really kind of the first steps towards that. If you look down below on sorghum, essentially the same thing, except sorghum, we don't have enough data to really pick apart irrigated versus dry land. So we're treating it as the same for now until our data tell us otherwise. But the fertilizer recovery efficiency and soil efficiency, that's just the same as what we just talked about on corn. And then if you turn the page on to page 6, we've got wheat. And again, it's essentially the same thing. We're not differentiating between irrigated or dry land, but you still have to pick a fertilizer efficiency and a soil recovery efficiency. Basically, everything else in here is largely the same. So our assumptions on mineralization. So for the warm season crops, we're still assuming a 20-pound credit for every percent of organic matter. So for corn and sorghum, 20 pounds per every percent OM. On the cool season crops for wheat, we're still assuming 10 pounds per percent of OM. So all that has stayed the same. All the previous crop credits by and large have stayed the same. I think there's been some minor tweaks in there. One other thing, zinc, I think I got to ask Orvar. I'm pretty sure we switched that, brought down the threshold value a little bit. That's on the last page or second to the last page. Threshold value of 1 part per million on zinc in terms of the recommendation. I think some of the Orvar's newer data supported dropping that down a bit. Questions or